Winter, 2008. The global economy is in freefall. Credit has frozen, consumer spending has evaporated, and across Europe, the automotive industry is violently slamming on the brakes. In boardrooms from Paris to Stuttgart, executives are deploying the standard corporate survival playbook: slash costs, preserve capital, and cull the workforce. Across the continent, European automakers are handing out P45s by the thousands. An estimated 10,000 manufacturing jobs vanish in what feels like a blink of an eye. But nestled in the rolling landscape of Derbyshire, England, something bizarre is happening at one massive car plant. The assembly lines have ground to a halt. There is no demand for the cars they make. Financially, keeping the factory running makes zero sense. Yet, every morning, thousands of workers are still clocking in. They aren't building vehicles. Instead, they are studying mathematics. They are repainting the factory walls. They are taking apart machinery just to learn how to put it back together. While the rest of Europe's manufacturing sector was throwing its workers onto the scrap heap, the management at this British plant made a decision that City of London financiers called financial suicide. They decided not to fire a single permanent worker. Why would a multinational corporation bleed millions of pounds to keep idle workers on the payroll? The answer isn't a story of British charity. It's a story of a cold, calculated, and entirely unorthodox business philosophy that exposed the fatal flaw in Western corporate capitalism. To understand just how strange this decision was, we have to understand the trauma of British manufacturing. For decades, the UK's industrial relationship was defined by bitter conflict, the us versus them mentality. You had management in their tailored suits and the shop floor workers fighting for basic rights through heavily politicized strikes. When times got tough, jobs were cut. It was the natural, brutal law of the market. Fast forward to late 2008. The subprime mortgage crisis in the US has mutated into a global economic heart attack. For car manufacturers, the situation is apocalyptic. People who are terrified of losing their homes do not buy brand new hatchbacks. Across Europe, the numbers were grim. Major continental rivals announced massive restructuring programs. Companies like Peugeot, Citroën, and Renault announced thousands of job cuts across Europe to weather the storm. The logic was painfully simple. Labor is your biggest variable cost. When revenue drops to zero, you must reduce your headcount to balance the spreadsheet. It's what business schools had taught for half a century. But the Toyota plant in Burnaston, established in 1989, operated on a different frequency. By early 2009, production at the plant had plummeted. Shifts were canceled. The sprawling complex, usually a hive of deafening robotic activity producing the Avensis and Oris, fell eerily silent. Local newspapers were holding their breath. Over 3,000 families in the Midlands relied directly on that plant, with thousands more in the local supply chain. The historical precedent suggested a bloodbath of redundancies was imminent. But management was looking at a different kind of spreadsheet, one that calculated the invisible cost of losing a highly skilled human being. To understand the crazy decision made at Burnaston, we have to look away from the City of London and look towards Aichi, Japan. The Toyota production system is famous for concepts like just-in-time manufacturing, but its foundational pillar is often ignored by Western executives: respect for people. In the traditional Anglo-Saxon business model, a worker pulling a lever is a commodity. If you don't need the lever pulled, you fire the worker. When you need them again, you hire a new one. Burnaston's management viewed their workers not as costs to be minimized, but as assets that had been heavily invested in. It takes months, sometimes years, to train a worker to spot a millimeter defect on a fast-moving assembly line. Firing them would mean throwing away millions of pounds of intellectual capital, only to spend it all over again when the recession eventually ended. But holding on to the workforce required a massive financial gamble. The factory was bleeding cash. A compromise had to be struck. Management approached the union, Unite, with an unprecedented proposal. There would be no compulsory redundancies for the core permanent workforce. However, to survive, everyone had to share the pain. They proposed a 10% reduction in base pay, coupled with a corresponding reduction in working hours. Directors and senior management would take pay cuts too, and theirs would be deeper. In a country historically scarred by toxic union management warfare, what happened next was remarkable. The workers voted to accept the cut. They traded short-term financial pain for long-term security. But here is where the story takes a turn from standard crisis management to industrial brilliance. With production slashed, you now had thousands of workers in a factory with nothing to build. If they sat idle, morale would collapse. So, the bosses turned the Burnaston plant into what was essentially a massive, fully funded university. Workers were paid to undertake rigorous training programs. They studied advanced manufacturing techniques, environmental safety, and problem-solving skills. When there were no more courses to run, they were handed paintbrushes. The workforce literally repainted the factory floors. They overhauled machinery that usually couldn't be touched because the lines were always running. Financial analysts looked at Burnaston and laughed. They saw an inefficient, bloated payroll, a charity operating masquerading as a car plant. But the bosses at Toyota knew something the analysts didn't. The recession wasn't going to last forever. And when the ice thawed, a brutal war for manufacturing dominance would begin. By 2010, the global economy began to crawl out of the wreckage. The cash for clunkers schemes across Europe suddenly sparked a massive demand for new cars. Across Europe, the companies that had ruthlessly slashed their workforces in 2008 found themselves in a chaotic scramble. They had to urgently recruit thousands of new workers. These new hires were untrained, inexperienced, and prone to errors. Competitors suffered massive delays, quality control issues, and immense hiring costs. At Burnaston, there was no hiring scramble. There was no drop in quality. When the order came from Japan to restart full production, the plant simply flipped a switch. The workforce wasn't just intact. They were vastly more skilled than they had been in 2008. The machinery was perfectly maintained. The factory was literally gleaming. Consider the human impact. For a typical worker at Burnaston during that period, the crisis wasn't a traumatic event that led to mortgage defaults and unemployment. Yes, a 10% pay cut stung. Families had to tighten their belts. But the crushing psychological terror of the 2008 crash, the fear of a P-45 landing on the doormat, was completely removed. In the local communities of Derbyshire, this meant stability. Local shops didn't go out of business because the factory workers still had wages to spend. The social fabric, which had been so brutally torn apart in other UK manufacturing towns during previous recessions, held firm. When production resumed, the loyalty the workforce felt towards the company was unprecedented. This wasn't the blind loyalty of a subservient workforce. It was a transactional respect. The company had protected them in the storm. And in return, the workers delivered some of the highest productivity and quality metrics of any automotive plant in Europe. It's easy to look back at the Burnaston case as a heartwarming anomaly, a rare instance of corporate benevolence. But that fundamentally misunderstands what happened. Retaining those workers wasn't charity. It was ruthless, long-term capitalism. The UK has long grappled with a productivity puzzle. For decades, British governments have obsessed over why UK workers seemingly produce less per hour than their German or French counterparts. Often, the blame is laid at the feet of the workers. But the story of the Derbyshire plant forces a mirror onto British management culture. The prevailing model dictated by the financial markets demands quarterly profits above all else. If cutting jobs makes the third quarter balance sheet look better for shareholders, you cut the jobs, damning the long-term consequences. The crazy decision not to fire anyone challenged the very core of this short-termism. It proved that a business can absorb severe short-term pain to preserve its most critical competitive advantage: institutional knowledge. Today, as we face new economic shocks, from supply chain collapses to the rise of automation and AI, the ghost of 2008 asks us a difficult question. When the next crisis hits, will corporations view their people as a cost to be aggressively cut, or as an asset to be fiercely protected? The answer might just determine which companies survive to see the other side. Thanks for watching. If this deep dive into the hidden machinery of corporate history made you think differently about how businesses operate, leave a like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments. Would you accept a pay cut to guarantee your colleagues keep their jobs?